Hey, so once more, congrats everybody on making it to Novice finals. And whenever Prime Minister is ready, I would like to invite them to start this debate for us. Thank you.
Okay, let me just set up my timer. Give me 5 seconds. All right. Um, yeah. All right, speech is going to begin. Wait, do I need to turn on my camera for this or do I not?
As ever you wish to do.
Okay. Uh, yeah, okay. My speech is going to begin in three, two, one. The rise in cutoff culture has been able to preempt many relationships. We tell you they lead to vastly worse relationships where you're unable to improve and seek anything and think about the relationship after. I'm gonna do three things for you in this speech then. First, tell you some framing on who interprets this narrative, how they interpret it, and then like frame out a few actors. Then I'm gonna give you 3 points on first, why you're unable to improve and why this matters. Second, on how this reinforces a culture of perfectionism in society. And yeah, and give you some weighing. So first then I'm gonna give you some framing. We tell you how do people interpret this narrative. This is very simple. When the actions of people that slightly fit a mold you make about toxic relationships on side opposition, you will cut it off. That's to say, this likely takes form in societal and external options. That's to say, friends are going to tell you to cut it off. Note how this is not objectively because something is wrong. It is inherently that you perceive that something is wrong. This is different because not everything you perceive is true. And in many cases, it is not likely to be true. An example of this is if a friend starts texting you for a few days, you inherently think they ghosted you, and then you cut off relationships with them. You also have other friends and external pressures telling you, oh, this friend is such a bad friend. He stopped texting you, so you should end your relationship with him. We tell you then that any relationship that is not perfect is a bad relationship on side opposition, and there are usually going to be expectations of no arguments, for example, in a perfect life as like a boyfriend, a girlfriend, or just a friend as a platonic relationship. We tell you then what happens after the relationship. After the relationship, you likely do not raise any questions about the relationship because you automatically assume the other party did something wrong. That's to say, when your friends cut you off, you assume the very action of cutting off was the red flag, so you simply do not care. Or if you are the person cutting off, you think that the very small action your friend did caused you to cut them off and forced you, so you probably would not reflect anyways. I'm gonna move on to my first point now. We tell you then that the counterfact. Oh, I'm gonna give you the counterfactual first. What is the counter?
TOI.
No, thank you. We tell you that people are able to see the signs as the same speed on side opposition. As I say, you allow the signs of toxic relationships to develop more, but you probably know that something is wrong anyways. You just don't cut it off immediately. Why does this counterfactual make sense then? We tell you that people are going to end it in an instant on side opposition. The analogy is this: a cold versus like COVID-19, right? You probably start with the same initial symptoms, except what it develops into is probably much different. We tell you on our side of the house, you stay more to see what this actually develops on, if it develops into an extremely toxic relationship or not. That is to say, most relationships are probably not going to be most relationships are probably going to be black and white on side opposition because it's like toxic or not. But on our side of the house, you're able to develop more. And in most instances, it might not be a toxic relationship. I'm gonna move on to my first contention then on how you're unable to improve in a relationship on side opposition. We tell you then inherently this motion prevents people from being able to solve problems. That's to say, cutting somebody out of your life is the easiest option and socially accepted on side opposition, and it's socially encouraged. So most people are going to take this because they're socially ostracized that they do not. This prevents people from having the tough conversations, for example, that resolve misunderstandings or clear up miscommunications. In cutoff culture, we were never able to learn how to set and communicate boundaries in the first place. Notably, it's able to even maybe set the ground for more like toxic relationships. We tell you the impact of this is very simple. You're able to on our side of the house, you're able to work through conflict because of the fact you don't cut off relationships. It's the easiest thing and the most encouraged thing in the first place. This leads to stronger relationships, while cutoff culture skips this entirely. We tell you inherently this needs to be done because of the fact that like on both sides of the house, you probably are unable to sustain your first few relationships. For your future relationships, the ones that you like go and marry and stay with for 40 years to actually like be good, and this is like probably the most important impact in this round. We tell you that you need past experience to know what you like. No, inherently, you're unable to get this on side opposition because when you see a flaw in the person, you instantly move on. Instead, on our side of the house, you do not move on. You're able to
TOI.
person and see their flaws. No, thank you. You're able to see what they did good, what they did bad, and when you eventually, or if you eventually break up with them, you're able to take that and move it to the next person to get experience and then get a much, much better experience in the future. We tell you that also people are unable to grow inside opposition. That's to say, this prevents you from learning how to grow sympathy. When you have different conversations, you're forced to consider the person's perspective on our side of the house instead on their side of the house, because social ostracization is happening, because you're able to social ostracize your friends and it's socially encouraged. We tell you do not consider anyone's perspective and you lack empathetic skills, which we tell you is very important, especially in today's world. Now, the third impact from this point is very simple. We tell this leads to isolation for the person who's like cut off, right? This is to say they feel disconnected from others and they get trapped and become for a part of a cycle of isolation. Meaningful and long-term relationships are going to be happening much less frequently than on side like opposition, because of the fact that you cut them off much easier. Moving on to my second contention then, about how this creates and reinforces a culture of perfectionism within society. We tell you the framing for this is simple. This creates unrealistic expectations in a relationship that is much higher than the status quo. At the start of a relationship, no, inherently from the first date onwards and during the first date, you're going to look for red flags that like society tells you, oh, as soon as you see this, you move on from the relationship. You instantly cut them off. That's to say, no one allows for them to understand that person and why they do this. No one understands if that person, for example, went through a traumatic event or something, because you simply do not care. You don't communicate or change. We tell you once somebody sees enough red flags, or like a few red flags, they end the relationship. We tell you then people are constantly tired because they think they have to be perfect or else no one will like them. That's to say, people end up being stretched very thin. You are forcing yourself to inherently become perfect and tell you this has a many, many, many mental problems. That's to say, in the end of the day, people who try to find relationships on their side of the house are going to be able to like feel very, very high amounts of mental stress because of the fact they think they need to be perfect. Note how inherently this is extremely bad. Well, because when you have mental stress, you probably like do things much worse. You're unable to improve as a person as much. You probably have depression, and you have things that like is extremely bad for both parties. We tell you then that this also leads to detachment. People who feel exhausted emotionally end up withdrawing from relationships or like being worse, like becoming a much worse partner much easier because you're emotionally distant. You think society, and by extent of society, your partner inherently forces you to become perfect because of the fact that like if you don't, they're gonna cut you off. No, inherently, maybe this is not true on side opposition, but it's that very action of you convincing yourself that this is true that actually matters in this debate. So when you are emotionally exhausted, it feels like there is no room to give more. So at a certain point, relationships, which inherently requires a lot of emotional labor, just feels like a burden to people instead of something that you support each other. When you're unable to support each other in a relationship, when you just feel like you have to give everything to the other person, or else they will leave you, we tell you this pretty much defeats the whole point of a relationship outside opposition and outside government. I'm going to tell you then, frame out a few actors. Because we tell you that inherently, when we tell you that government opposition cannot run a case on how you are able to get toxic relationships. Note that the toxic relationships on both sides probably come from having sides in the first place. So therefore, we tell you that bad relationships, such as not deep relationships, or like are going to break up on either side of the house. The stupid people, or the people that are unaware of like the signs of like your partner beating you, for example, your partner like inherently like calling you something very bad every single day, the people that get stuck in this cycle are not going to be able to see the signs anyways. We tell you that most people on our side of the house are still able to do this. So any like case they give you on having more toxic relationships is simply untrue, as we don't tell people you can't leave, just to leave later, because in the majority of cases, the signs that you see initially are probably not going to develop into a very toxic relationship. That's to say, we tell you we're able to give you the most impact. Because inherently, note this, the very point of having a relationship is to be able to improve, especially in your first few relationships. That's to say, to find an actual long-term meaningful relationship, you need to have experience and you need to be able to know what you like. You're unable to get this on side opposition. So we tell you it is much more likely that you're forced into a relationship in the future that like sure, you might like not be abused in, but that's to say you're probably going to be like this relationship probably is not most ideal for you. And no, you're never able to find out what is the most ideal for you in the first place because you lack experience and you're unable to see and will learn the weaknesses and the strength you want your partner to have. For those reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
For that fine speech, I just want to remind everybody that points are important parts of engagement in a debate. And whenever leader of opposition is ready, I would like to invite them to answer proposition's claims. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible?
You're both audible and visible, yes. Thank you.
Okay. I'll get out my phone. Hmm. Okay, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1, go. It's clear that government has then never been in a relationship, or at least hasn't looked outside of their own home. For that basis, I'm so proud to oppose, sorry. A couple things in the speech. First, some refutation, then on to the correct framing of when this is actually going to happen. Then I'll be going to the likely counterfactual, then on to the major push of side opposition. Couple things on refutation then, right? They tell you, oh, you're going to just break up at the single site of an abusive sign. We tell you that people just don't break up because of one red flag in status quo already, right? You don't just have, I just don't break off my friendship with a friend just because this narrative tells me to, right? It's highly unlikely and it's just empirically false, right? And beyond that, we tell you that oh, your interpretation of what is bad is going to be up to the individual. We tell you that it's pretty clear. If you see your friend doing drugs, you can kind of tell that maybe it's a bad thing, right? Now this thing on like perfectionism, right? You see a red flag and then you leave that relationship. By definition, this is not the motion. This is not the thing that we're talking about. In the Infoslide, it says being in a toxic or harmful person. This is not a red flag. And even then, the impact of social media greatly influences that. And it's unclear why this is the only or the most likely factor, right? They tell you, and then they tell you how abuse is just your partner punching you or verbally abusing this. We tell you that this is not an accurate depiction of what abuse is, and we'll give you the correct thing. Okay, now onto the point of framing. When would this actually happen? I'll tell you that this is when the relationship is truly toxic. This is pretty intuitive. When someone is truly harmed, they don't want to feel emotional pain. This is the most likely case because one, presumably, people care about their partner and want to stay with them, so you need a pretty powerful force to make them leave. This doesn't look like your husband not doing the laundry, so you're going to divorce them. It looks like your husband going to multiple clubs every week. It is very, very important to note and write this down that if the person doesn't leave on Gov, they won't leave on off. Write that down. Second mechanism then is that if the relationship is really, really good, then this doesn't apply because there is no signal, no forms of coercion that someone could actually base yourself off of and break up. But thirdly and lastly, we tell you that if someone is willing to break up because their partner didn't respond to their text after 0.1 seconds, then they would break up anyways because it would just happen over and over again, and their trigger for breaking up is such a low barrier of entry. Let's be as charitable as possible with this counterfactual and say that there's a likely counterfactual that you will still have people breaking up and want the better for their mental health and their because of mental health issues, mental health movements and stuff like that. We concede to that, but you don't have this instantly, and you don't have that an instant change, an instant breakup that is fully contributed by this culture. First argument then, on the basis that people are able to cut out bad actors in their life, we get better healing and less abuse, etc. Couple reasons. First, as I have already characterized, I tell you that this will happen when the relationship is truly bad. You kind of just don't leave your partner because you feel like it. So more likely than not, people are going to break up with bad actors and people that they perceive as bad actors. Two, we tell you that you have a lack of a coercion within the relationship, right? Only by breaking up abruptly can you stop this coercion. Okay, a quick intuition pump. If your partner is showing signs of being toxic, etc., you break up immediately compared to taking a longer amount of time, right? You start to not hang out with that person as much, and you start to see other people more without actually breaking up. That partner can see that and can be more coercive. When they see that the power over you is fading, they're likely to be they are likely to want you to stay in that relationship, and that's their way of dealing with stress and abusing you and stuff like that. Their punching bag is wanting to leave, and they are likely to say things like, "Oh, I can't leave without you," or straight up be more restrictive, like you can't hang out with more of your friends, or even just be more violent and to like quote unquote keep you in your place. This is necessarily the world that Gov has to defend for for two main reasons. One, we believe that breaking up with someone is hard. We make that less difficult when we tell you that the verbal abuse that someone receives isn't just them being drunk. It's something very unhealthy that will harm them in the future. This is really important. This This is the tipping point that allows us to get our impact. This narrative necessarily acts as a counterbalance to the thought that, oh, they're just a good person, or reflecting on this nostalgia of it all, right? But B, we tell you that they don't people don't want to be with abusive people, so they aren't likely to break up if they aren't likely going to break up immediately, they're likely going to distance themselves from them because you don't want to be verbally abused, you don't want to like hang out with them as much. So that partner is going to see these signs and going to restrict your movement even more. Sort of, and prevent you from leaving that relationship even more. A third mechanism then is that other narratives about mental health and surrounding yourself with good people are ineffective. Why is this? They are too late. By the time you start avoiding them or spend less time with your partner, it's too late because of the coercion I already talked about. We need this instantaneous thought, uh, um, instantaneous thought that bringing up now isn't bad, which I will touch on later, to make people doubt toxic behavior. B, we tell you that that they are way less susceptible to being misinterpreted, right? When people say surround yourself with good people, you want to make yourself believe that your partner is abusive because you spend so much time with them. However, when it comes to cut-off culture, it's specifically because of toxic behavior that you break up and cannot be molded by an individual. We ask people if your relationship is abusive or not instead of is your partner a good person. We look at concrete action instead of internal reflection. People are more likely to think, oh, I don't need, people are more likely to think, oh, I don't need no man, doesn't apply to me since my partner is such a good person. But C, and most importantly, even if you don't buy these other narratives, why not just have both and have people be more willing to break off bad relationships? But fourth mechanism, and most importantly, the rise literally means that you normalize this cutoff culture since necessarily more people are doing it. Thus, you are more likely to have people at least think about when you see movie stars abruptly ending their relationship, when your friend does it. If you're more likely to have the internal reflection of is my partner abusive? If yes or no. This means that you think it's the normal for you to counteract thoughts like what would my parents think? What would I do without them? This is the tipping point. This is really important because we are able to counteract these thoughts. The impact is simple. You cut out bad actors out of your life quickly, so they can't coerce you. You have more people leaving bad relations. You lack an instantaneous counterbalance on side job. This looks like less abuse, less people's liberties being trampled over, etc. We obviously care the most about these actors because they are the ones being abused and they are the ones who suffer the most when it comes to this to toxic relationship. The way here is simple and very important to note down. Even if we have some good relationships that are being broken apart, in our worst case scenario, we prevent abuse. Even if both sides are equally as likely, and you ignore all of my characterizations before, you prefer not having someone die of domestic abuse than having someone break up their high school romance. You could find someone else, and specifically earlier in life, it was going to fizzle out anyways. The key weighing here is that on site gov, you could find someone else. You could find someone else that is a very good person on site. But on their side, actually, these people lack that ability. They lack that ability because they have been mentally scarred by these people on that simple weighing. And even if one person's life is saved on our side, we win this debate over breaking up with your high school like romance, right? On that basis, I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. And whenever Deputy Prime Minister is ready, I would like to invite them to continue this debate. Thank you. Is Deputy Prime Minister ready?
I'm going to point out some major strategic flaws in Ops case. And that is they assume a few things. First, they assume that people actually buy into the narrative. Second, they assume that everybody buys into the narrative. Second, they assume that abuse is actually a huge problem in society. Let me explain why this is wrong. Because Okay, because like call out culture, right? People do buy into it. That's why it exists, right? It is unclear, but they're impacting people that are not buying into this narrative in the status quo, anyways, right? It is unclear why everybody's going to buy into this narrative. Sure, let me illustrate this. This is going to have an extension, by the way. This is going to be the overuse of this narrative. Here's why it's going to be overused. It's going to be overused because you have confirmation bias, right? As Kevin illustrated, right? You're essentially trying to like find confirmation bias. You're essentially treating every clone as a potential case of Black Death, right? And we tell you that this culture not only means that you personally, right? That also means there's gonna be discussion, right, on social media or in real life about like what is toxic and what happens, and like what is not toxic, right? And here's the reason why it's gonna be overused and abused. Because if a group of people who are convinced that their partners are abusive, for example, or a group that is actually looking out for signs of abuse that have confirmation bias, right, come together, right? What happens is an echo chamber, right, of people, right? We're overthinking things. Yes.
Okay, if a person is going to break up because of the smallest sign with cutoff culture, why are you able to claim that this is going to be a good relationship on your side of the house?
Oh, but our impact's not going to be on the relationship. Okay, our impact's going to be this because these people drive the social discussion around what is toxic and what is not toxic. And what necessarily happens is that if you have a bunch of people that like vilify being toxic and that like advise other people break up with their partner at the first chance, right? That really care about this, right? That means, right, toxic will just be thrown around, for example, as a dirty word, right? And the problem, I think, Kevin really already illustrates to a certain extent, right? The problem with this is that the word toxic will be applied to things that they think are toxic, but not really toxic. Right, and a useful example to think of in real life is that a lot of things are called fascist. The problem is not everything that is called fascist is fascist. The problem is twofold here, because people that don't buy into the narrative, right, which it probably exists in the status quo, that looks like people that have grown up before like the internet, right, that looks like people that haven't experienced relationships yet, right? That looks like them not being able to care about toxic relationships as much, right? Because, for example, if the word fascist is thrown around, right, when someone is called fascist, right, your first thought is not instantly to think of this person as fascist. It's to think that the person calling that other person fascist is ridiculous, and that the word fascist doesn't mean anything, right? So what I'm essentially explaining here is that like you cannot distinguish what is actually toxic and what's actually not toxic. Here's a second. This actually impacts people that are in abusive relationships worse, because if they have a like social form that's like, no pun intended, toxic, right? They're not gonna, right? And they see the like warning signs of like actual like toxic relationships like being discussed in there, right? What happens like when the word toxic is overused is that they're gonna doubt that that their relationship is actually toxic, right? They're gonna doubt that their case actually applies, right? Like, right, the problem of being toxic is trivialized, and like it just loses its meaning. So here's why this extension is what wins this round, because when Op talks about how it raises awareness around toxic relationships, we prove that this awareness is actually harmful, right? Because eventually toxic just becomes a word that you throw around, right? It is counterproductive to people who are actually in toxic relationships, who begin to doubt their own experiences, right? It is counterproductive to people that don't buy into the narrative, because now they don't think a toxic relationship is such a large problem, because it is talked about in such an exaggerated way, and right, in such an exaggerated way that like it's not that like the actual discussion isn't useful anymore. Okay, here's how I'm going to rebuild on Kevin's case. Kevin tells you that tells you two things. First, that you're unable to improve in a relationship. That is, right, when you're searching for the signs of this person being toxic, and you find a sign that immediately incentivizes you to cut this person off, right? Note that this is especially true because we're talking about, right, a rise in this culture, right? The rise in this culture necessarily means that people are going to, people that buy into this narrative is going to resort to this narrative increasingly, right, much more, right, as a method of action, right? This is going to replace, right, things as normal breakups and stuff, right? And what happens is that you actually don't know what's toxic anymore because you're so scared of what toxic is, right? You don't want to touch it, right? The problem is the way you learn about what toxic relationship is that like people tell you, right? People tell you like what actual toxic behavior is, right? Or you actually experiencing a degree of toxic behavior, right? The problem with like ops is that, right, you leave a relationship before anything actually happens, right? This is actually worse because eventually you're going to be in like a relationship, right? Eventually you might be in a relationship that may be a bit toxic. Eventually you might be in a toxic relationship, but at this point, right, you already like, at this point it's already too late because you don't know what's toxic, because you avoid toxic at first time, because you don't like give your partner the benefit of the doubt, right? At that point, right, you don't actually know what toxic is, and that just completely destroys ops benefits, because if you don't know what like toxic actually is and you just go off your own thoughts, right, it's unlikely that you're actually going to preempt toxic relationships, because they employ like a mix of stuff like charisma and love bombing and stuff, right? You have to actually like know about it seriously to prevent it. Okay, here's why we win then. We win because we prove that you are worse off inside a relationship because you don't get sufficient experience of what a bad relationship actually is, right? You don't self-improve. You don't know like what partner fits you and what partner doesn't, right? You're likely to just resort to cutting them off. But secondly, well, we also completely co-opt ops benefits, because what ops tells us is that you get more awareness. What we tell you is that this awareness is bad. We tell you that this awareness actively trivializes the problem. We tell you that people don't actually know what a toxic relationship is anymore, right? We tell this is exactly like the boy who cried wolf, right? The more time you cry wolf, the less people are going to believe that you cried wolf. And when a wolf actually comes, you're dead. And this is why I'm so proud to propose. Vote proposition.
Thank you for that fine speech. Whenever Deputy Leader of Opposition is ready, I would like to invite them to continue this debate.
Okay, I'm just gonna make sure first that I'm audible.
Yes, you are. And visible.
Okay, wonderful. Let me just get my timer set up quickly. Okay. My speech will start on my first word. Panel, the entirety of second government's case can be explained with a linguistic phenomenon. I think that this is probably incredibly unstrategic and is often going to lose them the round. What am I going to be doing for my speech today? Firstly, I'm going to be dealing with what we hear out of second proposition, on their idea of how this shifts the narrative of what toxic actually means and how this is harmful. And then I'm going to be explaining how this can be simply explained by a linguistic phenomenon. Then I'm going to be going to a little bit of constructive. One, on how this leads to people's escapism and not actually addressing the problems at hand, and instead looking towards stopping from leaving these relationships because of this, and then talking about how this affects interpersonal relationships outside of romantic relationships, because panel, we think up to this point in this debate, government simply hasn't touched how this affects interpersonal relationships outside of romantic partners. Okay, first of all, dealing with the argument that we hear of second proposition. Panel, they tell you that, oh, when you have this idea of like cutoff culture and seeing things as toxic, what's going to end up happening is people are going to be viewing too many things as toxic, and this is bad. Panel, I'd like to introduce to you a simple linguistic idea called concept creep. Humans literally can't stop making hyperboles. It's part of our nature. It's just something that we do. And as we do this, we slowly turn away from incredibly medicalized language. Toxic has a specific definition and one that is incredibly important. But as it gets more picked up and used by the general populace, it's something that gets turned anyway. We think then that because toxic is used even without this cutoff culture, you're likely to see this as a problem anyway, where people are turning towards this as a way to describe literally any sort of bad behavior. We think then that we can probably take out the vast majority of what second government says in terms of actually increasing the way that people use toxic, in terms of like diluting the way that what it means, because even words like depression, etc., have had their meanings diluted by the fact that they've been used so much. We don't think that cutoff culture is the tipping point to this. Okay, what then is my constructive in this? What then are going to be my constructives in this speech today? Firstly, let me talk to you about how this encourages escapism over actually fixing the problem. When individuals have a narrative that stigmatizes the swift extraction from relationships, toxic or not, they're more likely to turn to dangerous coping mechanisms that don't actually fix their problems. A few reasons for this. One, when this sort of behavior isn't widely accepted as being okay, it's now easier for individuals to justify staying in these relationships by pointing to negative externalities, i.e., oh, what would my friends say if I broke up with this person? What would my family say if I broke up with this person? Secondly, we think it assigns a sort of arduous formality to breakups, and this is negative for two reasons. One, we think that it creates a mental barrier between being in a relationship and not being in a relationship, i.e., oh, I would break up with this person, except, it would be too much work, so I'm not going to do it. We think that this is often used as a reason or a justification for individuals who aren't going to get out of relationships because they simply see it as too much of a task. Whereas in cutoff culture, you simply don't have the same thing associated with it. Secondly, we think this gives extra chances to abusees. We see this coming out of my first speak already. I'm going to be expanding on it. We think that the formalized version of, oh, we've had a good time, but I think it's time to go our separate ways type of breakup gives abusees a chance to regain their footing and implement abuse tactics like love bombing. This is further impacted by the first reason under this point, because whereas often individuals are reluctant to break up, this means that the abuse tactics keeping these individuals to stay are able to be a lot stronger and can be used at opportune times. We think then that the comparative of this is with the rise and normalization of cutoff culture, quick, abrupt, we're done, and then you block them type of breakups are something that are able to actually stop these things from happening. Okay, then onto my second piece of constructive, actually analyzing how this affects relationships outside of romantic relationships. I'd like to say that I think proposition has entirely missed the fact that not only can romantic partners be abusive, but also family members, and family members bring with them an extremely unique type of harm. There's often a lot of friction in separating from family members because you have such an interpersonal connection to them. That being said, these individuals can still be abusive and still can be harmful to your quality of life. We think then that with the actual rise of cutoff culture, we're able to reduce this friction and get these people out of these relationships. Okay. What then do we hear out of proposition? Why do we think that it's necessarily wrong in this debate and simply false? Let me see if I can find my notes here. Yes. Okay. Panel, out of first speaker, they essentially say that, if they're going to be seen as toxic relationships, I'll take you as a second, as the moment they're going to be seen as toxic relationships, they're going to be cut off. I think that my first partner adequately deals with this, but I'm going to be dealing with it after I take this POI.
I think two premises in your speech right now is false. First, you say that it's hard to break up with family and that it's gonna be easier on your side. But the reason it's hard is simply because you're intimate with them and that it doesn't change on their side of the house, right? But the second premise is that there's a large problem with pressuring from breaking up from romantic relationships. But that's also false because we're in modern society and people break up whenever.
Okay, yeah, I get the idea of your point. The problem is it's empirically false. There are external pressures that are stopping you from leaving your family or relationships. If you right now try to say, mom and dad, I don't like you, I'm going to go and live far away from you, there's probably a lot of friction in doing that because individuals think that, oh, we should stick together as a family. There's external narratives that push you to do this. I don't understand what you're getting at through this. Okay. What then does proposition say? They essentially try and say that, oh, the moment you see a relationship as being quote unquote toxic, you're going to leave it. I think that this is probably it can be mitigated to a very, very vast extent, because if you're going to leave a relationship the moment that you see it as toxic, or that there is something that is considered so much of a deal breaker that you're going to cut them off in an instant, this probably isn't a relationship that's going to be going far. Relationships are built on the concept of being able to work around and build off of your partner's flaws and being able to accept them. We think that cutoff culture doesn't necessarily change this. If you're able to accept accept your partner's flaws on either on their side of the house, you're probably able to accept your partner's flaws on our side of the house because they're actually able to grow off of them. We think then that even still, with our second response to this, is just look at status quo. Panel, in status quo, where cutoff culture exists, you don't simply break up with somebody the moment that they have something that could be considered quote unquote toxic. Even still, we think that people are willing to build off of and work around these things. Okay. They then try and give you all of this stuff on how, oh, you're never actually going to be able to like build off of relationships and do better in relationships because you're never actually going to get into any. We think this falls into the same reasons. Okay. They also then try and give you all of this stuff on why people aren't likely to buy in abusive relationships. Panel, I'm going to be getting into this further in weighing. We think this puts them in an interesting position because if people don't buy into this in abusive relationships, then why are they likely to buy into it in unabusive relationships? Okay. Then, like the rest of the second proposition speech I've already dealt with to the extent that it's simply talking about concept creep. Okay. Then on weighing, panel. Why, even if we are super mega charitable and we accept the harms that the government imposes on this, why are we still winning? We think that we're winning for two reasons. One, the severity of our impact. Even if communication is reduced and closure isn't enacted, we think that we're still able. We think that what my partner tells you, what I tell you, are still able to win on terms of analysis on why it's beneficial. We say that even if you don't buy this, we say that the impact of this narrative allowing people in abusive relationships to get out infinitely outweighs some people not committing to relationships for a few reasons. One, we think if you're if you're going to break up over the smallest thing, logically this probably wouldn't have been the longest lasting relationship. And two, you can always find a new partner. We think that necessarily if we're able to help one person on our side of the house, we're able to immediately win over side government because they simply are able to provide that much higher of an impact. Then, secondly, uncertainty of impact. Gov is put in an interesting position because if they want to argue that this narrative isn't strong enough to make people leave abusive relationships, then they also have to prove that this narrative is strong enough to make people leave healthy relationships. This means that the Gov burden is twofold. One, they have to prove that this is not only strong enough to take people out of abusive relationships, but also keep them in abusive relationships, but also take them out of healthy relationships. On the comparative, we just need to prove that this is going to get people out of abusive relationships. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that fine speech. And whenever a government whip is ready, I would like to invite them to deliver last constructive speech of their side.
All right, give me 1 second. Okay. Time starts. 3, 2, 1. The only refutation we ever get from op is a simple response to an example we gave. They were never able to actually refute the crux of our case. I'm so proud to propose. Two themes in the speech then. Firstly on the individual and then secondly on society and others. But I really quickly want to take down opposition's framing. They say when this will actually happen and when the relationship becomes toxic. And I think this is just simply not true. Because look, the entire point of cutoff culture is to stop is to stop in whenever a simple sign begins in the first place. So this means then they're simply going against the spirit of the motion. They can't just say that, oh, when the relationship becomes toxic and then it's actually a really big toxic relationship and you talk through it and you break up. This is just simply not what the motion tells you. The motion explicitly states that you stop it abruptly when there are signs of it becoming a toxic relationship. That means then that it has not become one yet, and it also means you have never been able to talk through in the first place. Secondly, let's talk about how you break up with bad actors quickly. This is just simply mutually exclusive. I'll expand on this later. Why is our framing so important and true? First of all, because I think that it is just something that is empirically true. In the end, the cutoff culture is impacting all of our lives and all of our relationships. I accidentally ghosted my best friend for a week. When I finally responded, he said that he thought I hated him, and soon later, he blocked me.
POI.
Flail their arms at facts because cutoff culture has impacted all of our lives in ways where friends and other friends and other loved ones are going to just cut us off, even if it wasn't something that we actually meant to do and something that has become toxic. I'll take you later if I have time. First theme then on the individual itself. I think there are two main pushes for opposition that we get. One is that a partner shows signs of being toxic, and so you have to break up immediately. Two responses here. Firstly, name one relationship that did not have any toxic signs. And I think that Op is just simply unable to, because in the end, every single relationship did have ups and downs. Every single one that turned out good, and every single one that, and every pair that was thought to be soulmates still probably ghosted each other at some point, or still maybe got mad at each other at one point. They are not able to win on them saying that, oh, if you're toxic, you have to instantly break up. I'll probably get to your PY later. But secondly, even if it does turn toxic, then you still will break up on our side. What does this actually mean? Because I think it's very simple here. The premise is that just because you do not have to leave immediately does not mean you will stay forever. It's not black and white. But just because you don't instantly leave does not mean you have to stay indefinitely. The problem here is that when people understand that, oh, this is a toxic relationship, I am going to leave. And they probably already have some kind of instance in their mind. So they're probably inclined to leave when they see that it's becoming far worse. So they're not able to simply win on them saying, oh, you can break up immediately. That's not something that's actually happened. That's going to happen. All right, the second push is on how you're too late. And I think I'm going to get out. And I think I'm going to refute this by taking out their toxic abuse case entirely. I want you to first know what their case hinges on. Then we talk about how a toxic relationship needs to be left in the first instance, and that it begins to happen. So their case entirely hinges upon a toxic relationship having to leave when the second signs appear. I want to paint you a picture as to why this claim is wrong. If Kevin and I got into a relationship and he started showing signs of being abusive, on Op, I'll instantly break up after he gets mad at me once. Let's say we buy Op's claim then, and then on our side, these people stay. Know why people stay in toxic relationships in the first place, and know how this never comes out of their speeches at all. Because firstly, and there are four main reasons to this. Firstly, they were never able to leave, which means that they probably were never going to be allowed to leave, or the partner is never allowing them to leave on either side of the house. Secondly, they think that they can change them. And it doesn't matter what happens, but it's probably better on our side when you see that you cannot change them, so you're more likely to leave on our side. On their side, it means that you're still thinking that you're able to change them, and you're going to continue this indefinitely. But third, you need them in some form. So this could look like them needing their money, or this could look like them needing a house or somewhere to live in, or this could look like them giving their children opportunities to go to school. So they obviously need them in some form, so you're still likely to stay on both sides of the house. And fourthly, they never had the willpower to leave. So this means that you're never going to leave on either side. This is very simple. On either side of the house, you're never going to leave this toxic relationship. Op exclusively had to defend why none of these reasons matter, and why even if that was true, it means that people are still going to leave more on their side. Not how they never do this, and not how they're still never going to be able to do this, because all the reasons that I've told you as to why people stay in toxic relationships are those that are going to exist on our side as well. Op says that the breakups that happen on our side happen on theirs too. But the problem here is that the actual problems happen where these breakups don't happen. So you're never able to impact on those. Rebuilding them. Kevin really smartly frames out how people actually interpret this narrative. When the other person is not completely perfect, and let's say accidentally goes through a bit, and then you cut them off. Know that we don't have to defend what Ka of culture actually tries to say, but rather how people interpret it. Secondly, other people are also pushing you to cut them off. While the relationships that break up easily are still going to be very good. And this is simple because it means that every single relationship that has happened needs to have some bumps. Which means that you need to go through these challenges to actually have a good relationship. The counterfactual then, and this is also pretty simple.
last chance.
Instead of just simply no thank you, instead of just simply ending it at the very start, you're far more likely to you're far more likely to wait for these signs to actually develop. You're still able to leave these toxic relationships on our side of the house. Secondly, an argument about improvement. This premise is very simple as well, because you're never going to be able to learn. You don't think you did anything wrong, but also you're unable to solve problems, and you don't get any emotional bond and forgiveness. Note the impacts here. Firstly, you're never going to get into a good relationship. And this means then that it's very difficult for you to get into one. Also is the argument on perfectionism. But I think even more importantly, you're never gonna have a good relationship. Why is this so important to these people then? Because in the end, you'll go your entire life without ever having a partner. And you're probably gonna have a lot of trust issues and mental trauma because every single partner that you've had has left you. You know why this is so important? Because all the people that desperately want relationships, that desperately want partners, are never gonna go to get one because they never learn from these things. The thing that everyone they had is bad. They have trust issues. They develop mental trauma. All right. Second theme then on society and others. And they tell you about non-romantic family relationships like family. But I think it's also exclusive here. And I want to buy what op literally concedes. In their second, they say, oh, you're my family. You can't leave. This is exactly why it is still not unique to their side. Because it is your family, it means that you're not going to be able to leave. The problem here is that the reason you cannot leave your family members is because you're blood related, and that the societal stigma that exists still is going to exist on our side and their side. They're not able to prove that just because cutoff culture exists means that you're suddenly going to be able to cut off from your family, the ones that are proven to be held most dear to you. The problem here is never their case basically falls when they fail to prove exclusivity. I want to quickly weigh on toxic relationships then, because firstly, the few people that they actually are able to impact exist on both sides. But secondly, Ferrari comes in with a case on the word toxic. And why is this so important? Because this actually impacts those within toxic relationships themselves. First of all, they don't think it's actually that toxic because of how much it is used. So the more that it is used, the more that people think, oh, this doesn't really matter because toxic is such a small thing. And because the word toxic doesn't matter anymore. So let's say Kevin just calls me a mean thing. Well, then I'm just going to suddenly call him toxic. And maybe that's what a toxic culture means. Or that's what a toxic relationship means. Secondly, then, I think the few people that impact are going to exist on both sides. But on our side, what happens is that so many people have to go through generational trauma because they're never able to actually find something to care about and make that last for a year or two. I'm so proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech. And whenever opposition's whip is ready, I would like to invite them to conclude the constructive part of this debate.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna cough a lot, so sorry about that. So there's some okay, I'll try my best not to cough, but I'm really sick. That's why I'm not opening my camera. Okay, my speech will begin on my first word. Panel, I think the reason why we can't name any relationship where people have the justification is that they're becoming toxic is because people left and now people have been saved from their abuse. Because I think on our side, if you have enough justification that they're becoming toxic, we think it's better to leave. 3 things I want to do for you in this speech. Firstly, refute everything that side proposition brings to you. Secondly, a massive reconstruction of how we actually build more emotional and psychological safety. And lastly, weighing on how we beat proposition everything. So there's 2 main claims that we get out of side proposition. 1, that you should stay more and see what it develops on instead of just directly cutting them off because you develop more. Secondly, how this just creates unrealistic expectations and how this leads to perfectionism and how you're going to constantly look for red flags. 1, I'm going to deal with this separately. 1, we tell you clear communication is a very sign of a trap in a toxic relationship because the argument for staying in a relationship to solve problems through clear communication simply just overlooks the reality of what toxic communication actually works, right? We tell you the opportunity for healthy and clear communication in many toxic relationships is either simply manipulated or prevented by the toxic individual. My second speaker already touched on you because we tell you that this looks like gaslighting, this looks like immense amount of emotional manipulation. And we tell you staying in these toxic relations to develop and somehow solve problems leads to more emotional exhaustion. And over time, this leads to the individual emotional resources as they're being drained because they're repeatedly trying to communicate and solve problems with someone who is not invested in these positive change. But secondly, how do we deal with the perfectionism point? I want to quickly note that having healthy boundaries isn't just about avoiding imperfection, but about having protection for themselves, right? The idea of avoiding red flags leads to perfectionism is this mischaracterization of what a healthy boundary actually looks like, right? We're trying to promote to have self-protection. And so we don't actually understand how this leads to imperfection because there's 2 different things. In a toxic relationship, these red flags are warning signs that shouldn't be ignored, and noticing them early is a very important part of protecting one's mental and emotional well-being here. The goal is not to be perfect or to avoid any minor mistakes. It's about recognizing these harmful patterns that threaten your emotional safety and establishing these boundaries to make yourself more happy. 2 burdens that we have established for you. 1, and how we must demonstrate a clean break through these cutoff culture, how this leads to improved mental health, and 2, how we must prove that cutoff culture must restore and empower the victim's autonomy. But before that, now explaining how we prove this, I want to get to some quick framing. I think it is very important to know that people should have their own boundaries in their relationship that makes them feel comfortable. They should be able to find a partner in which they can be themselves and be surrounded in an environment where people are comfortable to express their opinions. We tell you this is why we're so proud to stand aside opposition, because a clean break, or at least a sharp disconnection from a toxic individual, is much more beneficial beneficial to a victim's long-term well-being and recovery than attempting to actually remain in this prolonged state of confusion and limbo, trying to fix a relationship with someone who doesn't really want to fix it. So how does this cutoff culture actually help with that? And how, if you have any other narrative, we still win? This is flagging this as a massive reconstruction, but also taking down a lot of their claims. Okay, firstly, on how we must establish the clear and firm boundary to avoid this state of confusion and harm. We tell you in a long-lasting breakup narrative, which my first runner already explained to you is the most likely narrative, there's this expectation that the victim should stay in this relationship and try their best to fix it, right? This looks like them then enduring a prolonged period of this emotional turmoil and how them having more and repeated cycles of hurt before finally cutting ties later on. This might involve back and forth conversations and how them just constantly explaining to each other, you know what, let's actually fix this, and how them are actually revisiting these painful emotions and how them are just constantly living in this delusion and this false hope that the situation will be repaired, right? Over time, then, what happens is that this simply wears down the individual's confidence and their emotional well-being, because a clean break on our side of the house cuts off the harmful individual entirely, which offers immediate emotional relief, right? We tell you a cutoff provides a concrete boundary where there's no room for manipulation or gaslighting, right? In a toxic relationship where you already have the justification for so in status quo, we tell you emotional safety is a lot paramount, right? We tell you victims need a sharp break to avoid further emotional manipulation, and they need this clean exit to prevent their cycle of confusion and distress, which allows the victims to reclaim their emotional stability without this like a prolonged exposure to the abuser with someone who's just purely there just abuse you, right? We tell you this is a way to draw a very, very clear and distinct line between the past and the future, because for many victims, the lack of a clear boundary is one of the most damaging aspects of a toxic relationship. So when you cut off communication entirely, this is essential for them to reclaim personal space and their mental peace, right? This prevents the possibility of relapse and prevents the possibility of them opening up these old wounds that keeps them, that keeps this having an edge over them, right? How we actually reclaim emotional health without relapse. But more importantly, then, in these long-term breakups or these other narratives, when the person is still a part of their social circle or like these occasional contact, it is very, very difficult to move on fully. We tell you, these closure is often very, very postponed as the victim is left to wonder if, they made the right choice or not. There's this sense of false hope. There's this sense of false delusion, or that, if they're ever, oh my God, I can't speak English. If they're ever able to be trusted again, right? We tell you this: the longer a toxic relationship lingers, the harder it is for the victim to actually form new healthy relationships. This carries trauma and patterns of the past into the future. So how do we actually fix this? When you actually have a decisive cutoff, this leads to this immediate closure without the emotional confusion and this taking away this kind of back and forth pain of emotional labor of trying to constantly explain everything. This victim can now actually process the breakup more quickly. They can actually contextualize much more effectively. The clean break eliminates this space for them to have manipulation tactics, for them to be in the state of self-doubt that often comes with this prolonged engagement. We tell you, by having a clear cutoff by cutting off a very toxic individual completely, this victim takes full control of their future, which is crucial. Because underlying this panel, this isn't about running away from problems, but more about asserting their right to actually personal safety, asserting their right to their own well-being. They no longer need to engage with the person who actually caused harm, and they can now actually start living their life, rebuilding their life without having to justify decision or be subjected to these further emotional manipulation. So therefore, a quick weighing then, because I tell you that these cutoff culture in a lot of these romantic relationships and how we win on this clash, because this cutoff culture provides a quicker and cleaner escape, particularly for these individuals dealing with this very abusive and harmful relationship, with continuing contact in any way or form, in any other narrative, would cause more damage, as through our 24 minutes of speech, I've already told you, right? We tell you it is the first time when we offer victim the advantage of a swift and emotional clarity, and how we can actually give them the chance to actually control their lives and their own, okay, 1 second, after I finish this point, and how they can have more self-preservation. That is to say, let me make it clear throughout our 24 minutes of speech. If we are able to prevent at least one person from being abused, we win. If we're able to prevent one person, having the justification of this is turning into a toxic relationship, that they should cut off, that they should have the space for them to actually think about themselves, we should win. Yes, I'll take that POI. So
That takes time, unfortunately.
Okay, sorry. Okay, let me establish on how we proved our burden. let me make this straight. Our two burdens were very clear that how this leads to improved mental health and how people should have their own autonomy. We are the only side that actually tells you that people should actually take control of their lives, that they should actually take control of their own autonomy, how this leads to improved mental health because people aren't actually leading, people aren't actually, they're not being led on, they're not being kind of, just let in this state of delusion and confusion that they simply can't move on the past. A clear and decisive cutoff leads to this immediate closure without this confusion of constant back and forth pain. Panel, if we are able to prevent at least one person from being abused on our side, when they have the justification of status quo, when they have the justification of being in a toxic relationship, where we win this debate, so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. And whenever opposition's reply speaker is ready, I would like to invite them to conclude opposition's part of this debate.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, let me
Visible.
get my timer set up. All right. Okay, my speech will start on my first word. Panel, proposition loses this debate the moment that their conception of the opposition world is irreconcilable with the status quo. What am I going to be doing for you in this speech today? One, I'm going to be framing and pointing out to you how absolutely incredibly uncharitable the proposition side is to our side of the debate, how their debate land that they live in is entirely irreconcilable with reality, then proving that we beat them not only through refutation, but also weighing where we win in this debate. Okay. First, dealing with what the entirety of the conception of proposition's version of our world is. Panel, they tell you that people break up the moment something seems bad in a relationship, that nobody ever gets into any relationship, and that individuals are constantly worried about the way that they're viewed in relationships. We think that all it takes for you, panel, to believe that this is wrong is to look outside and look at the world. Panel, in no world is this something that actually happens. In status quo, people are able to form happy and healthy relationships irregardless of whether or not this narrative exists. I don't understand where they're trying to go when they say that nobody is ever going to get into a relationship, because this is entirely uncharitable and incredibly unstrategic, as they're taking, one, a very low burden in that the counter model that they try and bring to you is essentially just, oh, we'll break up a little bit later, and B, that they like entirely refuse to engage with the actual status quo. Okay, further then, what do we hear from proposition side of the house? Essentially, all that they tell you is based around the idea that people are never going to actually get into relationships, and they are simply going to leave them the moment that something seems wrong. Panel, while we can concede that cutoff culture in some instances may lead to relationships breaking off before they have the chance to fully develop, we think that it is entirely uncharitable for side proposition to say that in every single instance this happens. We then say that if this isn't going to happen in every single instance, we are able to win this debate if we're able to prove that some amount of people are stopped from staying in abusive relationships. Okay, what then is the weighing on this, and why exactly are we able to win in terms of people staying in abusive relationships? Panel, the proposition side tries to convince you that people staying in abusive relationships is entirely symmetrical because, oh, our model is essentially the same thing. Panel, I'd like to flag for you here that the proposition model is basically indifferentiable, like impossible to differentiate from our side of the house. Simply breaking up a little bit later isn't enough to prove a delta of change on their side of the house. We think then that we probably win this debate the moment that they aren't able to actually provide us a meaningful alternative to this problem, but we think then that we're actually able to still win on abusive relationships. Why is this? We think that by preventing abusive relationships from happening from the outset, instead of stopping them from happening after you're in them, is probably a lot more beneficial than having been in them for a while and then deciding that this is something that is harmful. We think then that we're probably able to win this debate on a matter of scale and certainty. If we are to believe what proposition tells us in terms of people leaving relationships, then people will leave relationships and people will leave abusive relationships. We say then that we are able to get people who leave abusive relationships on our side of the house, whereas on their side of the house, they provide no meaningful alternative. I challenge a proposition in this final speech from their side to prove to us that there is a difference between their countermodel and our side of the debate. I guarantee you there is no difference that can be proven. For the simple fact that we debated the side that was given to us in this motion, we are able to win this debate today. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for the fine speech. And whenever proposition's reply is ready, I would like to invite them to conclude this debate as a whole.
All right. My speech is going to begin in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in the speech today. First, I want to give you some framing on the status quo, then give you some refutation into toxic relationships. Then 2 themes on which side is better for conventional relationships, and then on societal impacts. First, then some framing. We tell you inherently in the status quo, you're able to have a great, a very small barrier for like toxicity. That's to say, no, already in the status quo, you can already break up because of preferences. You can already break up because of small behavioral issues or somebody's personality. That's to say, I think all positions concedes in this round that this is able to be lowered somehow. But the important thing to note from here is if it's already so low, we tell you that it's going to be, to raise it lower, simply risk the thing we said in our first speech and from our entire 24 minutes, which is the fact that you're able to break up much easier. Now I want to refute their whole point on toxic relationships. Because no, if they cannot prove this, then they simply are unable to win this entire debate. We told that all opposition is never able to prove to you the entire thing their case is hinging on, which is that small sides you see turn into a toxic relationship. That's to say, if you're going to be hit, you're probably going to get out of the relationship on both sides of the house. We tell you these smaller things more like one of the times, or one of the arguments, your partner calls you some abusive language, right? Like once in a while. We tell you that even buying their best case, it does not simply matter because the people first who are already in these abusive relationships are already very small, but second, they're only able to impact the people already deeply entrenched into an extremely small margin. We tell you they're never able to prove a large margin. Why is this? We tell you the main thing that these abusees face from their abusers is the fact that they fear their abusers are going to abuse them more when they leave the relationship. We tell you there are probably also friends of the abusers who support this abusement of the abusee in the first place. That's to say, we tell you, sure, societal pressure probably makes this better, to a very small margin. But because societal pressure is not the main reason these people are stuck in relationships anyways, we tell you that they often also times depend on their abusers for money, for things like shelter, and they have no other connections because they don't have a job, right? That's to say, societal pressure is not the main reason these people cannot get out. It is because they depend on the abuser themselves. This does not solve the problem at all, and I fail to see why this point works. But that is to say, we tell you that this is actually even probably worse on side opposition because the fact now it gives their abusers a way to blame them and to tell them that they were the problem. Note that most of these abusive relationships are also very nebulous. That is to say, the public probably cannot understand exactly very clearly what is happening because of the fact their abusees probably do not have such of a voice in either sides of the house as much as their abusers. It gives the abusers a chance to actually be able to speak out. So we tell you this simply does not stand. Now on my first theme about which side is better for conventional relationships. That's to say, the only thing they give on this point is mitigation, which they tell us the relationships which leave because of ghosting is also going to be very bad anyway, so it doesn't matter. I'm going to do a few things about this. First, we tell you there's a stage where people have this. That's to say, when you first meet a friend and then you ghost them the day after, they're probably not going to stay friends with you, even if for 1 day, simply because your connection is extremely nebulous, in the state is least. That's to say, the majority of people who are impacted by this are the people who are seeking relationships. The relationships are never able to get started off the ground. They fall after the first day, and we tell you it's extremely bad. The most important thing in this round is not abusive relationships. The most important thing is for you to be in a happy long-term relationship because these things last for many years, oftentimes leading to marriage. We tell you when you do not find the person you like for this, it is extremely detrimental upon your life and leads to many mental problems. That's to say, we tell you why are we able to achieve this. The most important cause is the most important reason you're actually able to achieve this is because you have experience. Know how intrinsically we get more relationships. So we tell you we're able to win drastically over opposition because they have no scale. But then on societal impacts, we tell you are also able to prove this because they only tell you that society is going to shun you for leaving relationships on abusive relationships. I think we're already able to prove why this is no margin of change. They give you concept creep only. I think we are giving you 2 impacts. First, social ostracization. That's to say, people are probably going to socially ostracize you when you leave this relationship. When the other person accuses you, which gives you a lot of mental problems. But the second is the fact that you're unable to get into relationships in the first place, leading to ostracization. I'm very proud to propose clear proposition ballot.
Thank you for that fine speech, and thank you all for this wonderful debate. Once more, congratulations to everybody for making it to Novice panels. Now, please leave the room so the panel can have deliberation, and the results will be announced after the grand finals. Thank you.
Thank you. Great debate.